We're going to be moving on to our next speaker, Madona, who's going to be talking about advantages of espresso test automation, how and why.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to put on my camera a little bit to say hi. Oh, I still have my Women Who Code background. I need to remove it. I forgot to remove it. I'm part of Women Who Code, and we had like a Halloween thing going on, and I forgot to remove my background.
Wow, that seems like an interesting event.
Yeah. So that's me. I wanted to just introduce myself, removing my camera. And today we'll be talking about advantages of espresso tests, automation, and how and why it's done. So I think with that, let me just, let me see here. Okay, so let's get started. Let me see if I can go next slide. Okay, I think I need to do this. Okay, good. Now, today's agenda, we're going to be talking about what is UI testing, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Android UI test automation. And I think in Android, it would be unfair to talk about everything without mentioning the flakiness. So I'm going to be sharing some resources. I'm going to talk about the UI Automator API tools that are there that you can explore. But I will also talk about the difference between Espresso and the UI Automator. We'll look into popular Android UI testing tools. We will look into a little bit of unit testing because mostly the two are always together. And the talk generally is to just motivate people to be writing tests. And then I'll talk about a little bit of CI/CD tools and then the conclusion. But before that, about me, I did open up my camera a little bit. So that's me. I work as an Android engineer, senior Android engineer. I'm also a GDG Android. I'm also writing my first book, which is, I'll talk about it later because I do touch on some of the topics of the books in there. And then I'm also a Women Tech Makers Ambassador. There is more. I'm a mom too. I'm also a GDG organizer. Find it to be fun, connect with the community, especially when you work from a home full time. It can get a little bit tough. So being connected to the community has really been helpful for me here in New York. But first, what is UI testing? So testing user interaction helps ensure users do not encounter unexpected results and or have a poor experience when interacting with your application. So UI testing basically can be defined as a process in which you verify that all functionality work as expected. And I know many of us here might have or might. One thing that I always want to acknowledge in advance is that there are chances where you might have written some UI tests and maybe you might have not written some UI tests. Mostly my talks are always kind of like interactive. And the one thing that I would like to ask actually the community or even in the chat is, I'm going to turn my video on a little bit, is have you ever written any UI test or unit test? That is something I would like to just see in the chat. I always ask this question before I begin my talk so that, no, okay, I see somebody said no. Yes, good. And this doesn't have to be only in Android. It can be in all the sectors of different stacks that we work with. Let's say machine learning or even web or iOS. Okay, so I do see a couple of yes, and I did see a no. And like I mentioned, I think it's always important to note that in different places and companies, not everybody writes tests. And that's definitely, I think I would say not okay, because I'm a bit opinionated on this, because I feel like tests are good. One thing though that I'm not always strong about is writing. I am not a fan of TDD because I know that can be nerve-wracking. TDD means test-driven development. If any of us have ever had that, that's what it means. But I'm always a fan of writing the tests after, which I know it's funny, but it's okay. So it's just my own kind of like in the way we write the test. So So one thing that I want to also talk about next is definitely the types of testing that we have. So the approaches that we have, if you're a software engineer, this is in general, because I know the audience might be Android, iOS, web, machine learning, is that there's manual testing and automated testing. So we're going to look into the first one, which is human testing, or if you want to call it manual. So what is manual testing? So I think most of us here definitely have done this. This is where you're trying to verify if your code is working. That is through just manually a human having a tester to perform a set of user operation on the target app and verify that it's behaving correctly. So the biggest problem though, however, with manual testing is that it consumes a lot of time and it's error prone because, I mean, we're just validating that this particular app works pretty well, but we are not writing some test cases to catch this before we launch to production, which means, especially in the Android ecosystem, we might have so many bugs going on because we have so many devices to support. Now into my second agenda, which is Android UI test automation. So why automation, right? So automated testing saves times and money. I think that's the biggest thing. And also I would want to call it bandwidth. I know that's a term many of us use at work. So manual repeating test is costly and time consuming. So once created, automated tests can run over and over again at no additional cost. And they are much faster than manual tests. And I do share like a pro here, like what is the advantages of doing this particular type of testing. And I share credits to where I got this because this was pretty great information at the end of my slide. So we will look into that later. But as you can see here, automated software testing can increase the depth of the scope of test to help improve software quality. Blank the tests that are often avoided during manual testing can be run unattended, which is very true. And then with now the cool CI/CD tools that we have, for instance, Bitrise, you can even schedule your tests to run as in parallel to your other work. And you can even schedule them for different days. Like it's super cool. So that's something that I did at work, which I find to be amazing. Now, but first, I always want to talk about also, because sometimes I find it pretty hard to just jump into, okay, this is what we need to test. This is why we're testing, or this is what automation testing is. But we can't do that without understanding actually what is being tested in this code, right? What part is important? And that leads me to my second part of the question. Actually, let me go back to my previous slide. It leads me to the question. I think every time I try to, I want to engage with the team a little bit here. Let me go back on this slide because I want to engage with the team. So one thing that I want to ask our members, let me see. So if you see me I'm trying to pull Zoom down. Okay, good. It's to kind of like have it, because I don't know why it's hiding up there. My bar is hiding. Oh, because I'm sharing the screen now. One thing that I wanted to ask the team or participants today is that if you write tests at your company, do you use any tracking tool for code coverage? And what I mean by code coverage is that some companies are very strict in the fact that you cannot deploy a certain code without a certain percentage being approved. Like in your PR, it might say, oh, this particular PR needs, let's say, 70% code coverage. So has anyone dealt with that? You can give me a yes or a no. Oh, let me put my camera on for engagement because I like to see people put it. Let me see a yes or a no. No, okay. Still waiting. Okay, no. Why new scale? Cool. Nice. Thank you everybody for responding. That's cool. It helps me at least kind of like understand. So the reason as to why I asked that is that there are companies out there that are very strict in the code coverage, and they always integrate it. Like for instance, they use there are tools, and one of the tools that I've seen being used is, let's say, the Sonar Cloud or other kind of like just other code coverage tested tools. The flaws with them, though, however, is that they're never very accurate. And you might find that they're trying to misconstrue the testing such that some parts of the code which should not be tested should be tested, which does not make any sense. So one thing that I've always looked into, which was frustrating at a company that I've worked with, because I feel like here in the States, that is really practiced a lot, because two of the companies that I worked with, both of them are using a code coverage tracking tool. And it was very frustrating to tell, like, let's say my boss that, hey, look, this particular code doesn't need to be tested because we've tested the enough functionality that we need here. So let's say the scope that we need. Now, that's why it brings me to this particular slide. So there are integration tests, unit tests, end-to-end. So unit tests or small tests only verify small portion of the app, such as methods or class. Now, end-to-end tests or big tests verify larger parts of the app at the same time, such as a whole screen or a user flow. Now, the medium tests are in between and check the integration between two or more units. Now, we do have UI testing suites, and here I'll be talking about mostly what we look into when we're testing. So some of the features included in UI tests are, for instance, functionality, right? You want to test your functionality. That is, does my app do what it's supposed to do? Now, in future slides, I will also show you which part of the codes are strongly to be tested as compared to which you should reduce the testing a little bit. Even though the Sonar Cloud is not passing on any other code coverage tool you're using, is not reporting it is correctly, you can have a strong argument to your boss or tell them that, hey, look, the most important part was covered by this particular code here. If it's not 100% or it's not 70%, maybe it's because it's not reasonable to test this as a part of the code. Now, another part, what you want to do is the performance, definitely, right? You want to make sure that the performance testing, does it quickly and efficiently do what it's expected to do, right? Now, we have another one, which is usability. And I like usability because this is very important, because if the usability doesn't work as expected, you will have people, either it's web rating your application bad, or if it's Android, giving you a bad rating, which can be pretty heartbreaking. Now, we also have the biggest one that I like, which is visual design. And visual design or UX is just making sure that everything is right where it should be and works as it should be. And is it compatible? And then last but not least, accessibility, very important. It's very important to make sure that our apps or everything that we build these days work well with accessibility services, because we want to make sure we support everybody in the world. Now, the test cases, this is what I was talking about. So the test cases that mostly we want to verify, for instance, are data type errors. That is, the test checks that only valid data can be entered for certain data fields, such as dates, currency, and many other. Now, another thing that I always think about is the field length. That is, the test checks that certain text fields do not allow users to place inputs over a specific number, a specific character limit. One day when I was building my application budgeting buddy, it's launched on the Play Store. I forgot to check that use case because I did not write test. That is before. And I remember the app kept crashing because people would just put like, they would press 1 and keep going, like, you know, when you press 1 in the keyboard and then it just keeps going, and it kept going, and then it would crash with the number exited out of exception. It was a Java thing, which is very funny. So I had to go and test that particular edge case. Now, something else that we always want to test is definitely making sure that our progress bar, because we use so many progress bars because there's a lot of loading in application and even web, make sure that all that stuff is working as expected and is caught earlier on. Now, if you're an Android engineer, you know that you might have seen this before. That is espresso testing framework. We now are really being encouraged to use Jetpack Compose. So Jetpack Compose definitely is offering some testing UI APIs, which is pretty cool. I've used it. UI Automate is a little bit older, but we will talk about it just a little bit. in comparison with espresso, which is what I use mostly. And then we have Robo-Electric, which I think it has a bit of debate, but it's not that bad to use. Now, I did talk about instrumented before versus local. So what are instrumented tests? Instrumented tests run on an Android device, either physical or emulated. The app is installed alongside a test app that injects commands and reads the state. Instrumented test reads the state. Okay, the instrumented tests are usually UI tests, launching an app and then interacting with it. Now, when we talk about local tests, what do we mean? We execute on your development machine or a server. So they are also called hot site tests. They're usually small and fast, isolating the subject area test from the rest of the app. And it's fair to also say that not all unit tests are local and not all end-to-end tests run on a device. I can give a simple example that is like a big local test. You can use an Android simulator that runs locally, such as Robo-Electric. I didn't mention that before, if you want to use Robo-Electric. Now, the small intermediate test, you can verify that your code works well with framework features, such as sometimes you might be using the room database, and you might run this test on a multiple device to check if the integration and the versioning of the room database is okay, because I know it's always important to run or check your DB. Now, so here I'm going to be walking through a little bit of code on how you can now, I talked about verifying a little bit of, like, let's say the progress bar. So here I talk about how you can do that in the new Jetpack Compose if you're trying to test. And as you can see there, they have this compose test rule that you can set content. And then my login content there is, I have this particular screen and I'm loading once all the inputs are entered. And if it's true, I should assert that the loading progress bar was displayed. And if it's not, and actually if loading is false, then it should not exist. The loading progress should not exist. I also did ensure that, since I know many of us are still using the old way of doing Android, I wanted to make sure that I show a little bit of how you can do this in XML too. And as you can see here, we have an ID where we get the login email, you put the input password, and then you log in, you click the button, and then you wait until the progress bar. And then as you can see there, you do what? You navigate where you want to navigate, or make sure that it's displayed. Now, I know most of us here might be using RX2, so I wanted to make sure that I get it for everybody, a simple example. And here, as you can see, we use a test observer, and then we check when the user is registered, we exit in progress, and then we await. And then we can assert that either the registered user was connected or not. Now, you can use test method to get test observer when you're making a session, and you can do things like, let's say, await, this is for the RX, await completion, assert count of value emitted, assert sequence item expected, assert a timeout, or assert unexpected errors raised. Now, I know RX is so huge and so much to talk about, so that's why I couldn't cover everything on this particular slide. So just give a simple examples on how you can use that. Now, in all tests, you definitely need to set up. You always need a setup. And instrumentation and instrumentation registration are low-level APIs typically used by high-level test framework. So it is generally not recommended to use like for direct use by most. But as you can see here, what we're doing, we are actually just setting up the activity that we'll be using, like the screening unit test rule that we'll use in our class. And as you can see, my arrow points into how we get the application contents, and then we set up the mocks. Now, that's also a little bit more of the setup on the on the Jetpack Compose side of things. And as you can see there, we are setting up that activity test rule, and then you can call that screen unit test rule that we've created before here and pass it here. And then you can navigate if you want to navigate, or you can do whatever functionality you want to do there. Now, I always want to mention this before, and that is taking advantage of long names when you're writing tests, because this is something that I figured really helps a lot, especially when you're trying to convey a message, because I feel like writing tests is like talking. I went to the market and bought 2 bananas, like you have to make so that if somebody in the future comes in, they're able to identify what you were trying to do pretty quick. And also try to make sure that they get it. And one more thing that I always want to mention, I always try to mention, but I know this might be a practice that I'm used to doing. That is, if I'm writing tests, I want to isolate each and every test separately, not write so many of them at the same time. That is, I make sure that if a function has a lot of things going in, let me isolate that. Let me make sure I'm testing a little bit that can be understandable, and where the next developer would be able to understand what I'm trying to do. Now, I got so many questions about testing navigation. That's why I included this particular slide. And as you can see here, this is something that many of us Android engineers would do, that is trying to verify if you can navigate to another screen once an action is performed. And here, as you can see, we get this particular launch fragment in a Hilt container, which is something we are provided if you're using, let's say, Hilt in your application, because I know many of us use dependency injection. That's how you can do it. You see, we create a nav controller and set the nav controller property on the fragment, and then we navigate later. Cool. Now, it would not be unfair if I didn't talk about flakiness, and that's why I wanted to introduce this particular slide. And mostly, the key takeaway for this is that most of it you have to read and kind of like understand how to write tests. But what I would say is make sure that you do not use the wait or sleep. Yeah, you should avoid pausing your tests for an arbitrary period, because it will just make it flaky. It will not work. And if there's one thing that is always annoying is flaky tests, because you can't do anything without checking into them. Now let's talk about the UI automated tools. Now, UI Automator is a UI testing framework suitable for cross-app functional UI testing across system and installed apps. And as you can see there, we have the UI Automator lets you interact with visible elements on a device, so regardless of which activity is in focus. And it allows you to perform operations such as opening, setting down a menu, navigating, and this is done all automatically, like something is just doing all these clicks for you. Now, one thing that I want us to note is that the UI Automator works on different APIs, and I'll talk about that. But here, as you can see, you can do a lot with the UI Automator. And there's more documentation on the Android Google site where you can just look into that and see what they do. But as you can see here, we can access the device state, change the rotation, press a hardware volume such as a volume up, press the back, home, which is most of the thing that we would like to do in manual testing. But now this can be done automatically. Now, I do share a little bit of code on how you can achieve this. And as you can see here, we have this device that we set to our UI device, and we get the instance. And as you can see, instrumentation is used again here, get instrumentation, and then we press home. Now, I do have some comments here. I'll also share the slides. If anybody also has a question, can ask me after the talk. But as you can see there, we can simulate like a simple functionality on performing, let's say, cancel button check, or we can do a menu check, or we can do a switch check. And the most important thing I wanted to showcase actually is how you set up. So as you can see here, the way we set up the other one for espresso, you can set it up here like this, where you have a UI selector. You always need to pass in your class, let's say the widget you're going to be testing, and then you call on the child selector and pass in the text. So the mobile app there, that is the name of my app, so that it understands what is being tested. Now, here, as you can see, it's a more continuation of how you can do that, because there's a lot of setup need to be done. And once your test has obtained a UI object, you can call the method in the UI object class to perform user interaction. That is, you can click, you can drag, you can set text. There's so many things that you can do once you've set it up. And you can clear text first, swipe up. And the UI Automator testing framework allows you to send like an intent or even launch an activity without using shell commands. Like, let's say by getting a contents, and that is just through the context object get contents. Now, I actually wanted to show a simple example how you might achieve this with a more understandable test where most of us can understand. That is, let's say you want to test 10 plus 6 equals 16. As you can see, this is a little bit tedious. I like to acknowledge that. But once it's set up, it's very nice. And one thing that I also want to mention is this, if your team has a QA team, most of this is something that they might be working on or doing at work. But if it doesn't, I think it's something that you can just as a practice, just do to make sure that you have automated way of testing, because sometimes it, like, again, it saves time and money for developers. But as you can see here, a simple example, we have that app package, and then we get the resource ID, which is 10, and then plus 6. And then as you can see, we have what we're verifying is the resource ID is equals to that. So when we verify the result, you can see what we do at the end. The line is that we take the results and the UI object and then tell the package name, this result will be equals to a sat16 and then result.text. It is tedious as compared to the way, let's say, we would do it in Espresso, because that would be a very simple line of code. But that remains to be something that both of us can agree on, like if you want to use Espresso or UI Automated. Now, I had this slide here to just kind of like showcase the differences, and I got this on Stack Overflow, pretty good example. So a UI Automated is a powerful and has good external OS system integration. E.g. can turn Wi-Fi on and off and access other settings during tests, but lacks backward compatibility. Now, for Espresso, it's a bit more lightweight compared to our UI Automated and supports 2.2 Froyo and app. It also has Fluent API with powerful Hamcrest integration. So I think this one leads us to saying that here it's an option where you can pick either if you're pretty passionate about either. But either way, I think to us, we use a lot of Espresso. Now, popular Android UI testing tool, I wanted to just showcase that. I don't know if many of us, of course, most of us have used Espresso. Others that you can use is Calabash, and some have heard of Calabash. There's the UI Automator, there's Detox, and then what we have, Monkey and AppCrawl. So I wanted to mention this so that you can see different ways that different APIs that are out there that you can use, that you can use if you want to achieve something similar. Now, I like the Espresso, and I talk about how it's pretty good. So I just touched on the pros, some advantages here. That is, it's fast and reliable. It can test web components too. It has a built-in test record, actually, active service and team. So it's pretty well supported, and it has a cheat sheet, which is super cool. It's easy to kind of like just walk with it. Some disadvantages, it runs only on an application at a time. Test cases can only be for Android. Yes, sorry if we have any web users. And the tests are written in Java or Kotlin, so you need to be Java and Kotlin. And then also the deep understanding which is required, which is a bit, takes a learning curve. I talk a bit about Calabash here, which is also an open source and free cross-platform UI testing. It can work efficiently with .NET, Java, Ruby, and other languages, which is cool. And it tests native and hybrid application if you're building hybrid applications. So I wanted to mention that. I did hear there's a new one also for, I think, React Native, if I'm not wrong. So yeah. And then Monkey is one that I didn't know about, that I actually realized it was there when I was doing my research. And it runs on your emulator or device and generates pseudo-random streams for users' events such as clicks, touch, gestures, as well as a number of system-level events. So you can definitely try using that too and see how that works out for your team. And more credits linked on the slide. And then there's the app crawler too. So this one is part of Jetpack, and to automatically test your app without the need to write or maintain on any code, which is interesting. So you might want to try it out. So the crawler runs alongside your app automatically, like issuing action, type, swipe, etc. to explore the state space of your app. And then the crawl terminates automatically when there are no more unique action to be performed. So the app crashes or a timeout you designate is reached. So that's pretty interesting too. So I would like for us to also try that if you're there. Now, I think, how am I doing on time? Let me see if past time. How am I
we
doing?
can have a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to make sure I'm on time. Okay, cool. Now, I always, like I mentioned before, right? If you're joining the talk later on, it's always important to talk, when I talk about UI testing, I always want to talk about a little bit about unit testing because it's both testing and it's very important. So on the UI testing part, I just talk about some of the things that I always look for let's say unit testing. That is test small unit of your code to validate their behavior, promote good loose coupling, always important because when it's highly decoupled, it's very hard to test, and avoid fragile code base to promote sustainable growth. I know this one here was a bit controversial where I talk about don't alter global state, should not communicate with external systems such as fake mocks. That one is also very debatable. And then view models, definitely, those are very good. We do know that they work, testing works pretty well with MVVM. It becomes pretty easier. And this is the one I was talking about where don't test private method, just public interface. I think that is something that it is a debate, but I kind of feel like if you've isolated the other tests in public methods, the private should be okay, but I'm always learning too. So I'm open to learning, and then other more. Some CI/CD tools that I mentioned, like before, we have Bitrise, Circle CI, GitHub Action, Travis, Jenkins. And as you can see, all of this are out there. And I know many of us might be using some. We use Bitrise at work. We found Bitrise to work for us pretty well. So I love it because it gives a lot of, let's say, the automation. There's a lot of support documentation. And then you can also view your test reports. And then with that, actually, I talk more about testing too on my book. That's my book that I'm writing now. And it's a cookbook, which is interesting because I was like, I don't want to write a professional book where it's just about Jetpack Compose. I want to do simple concepts where people can follow through, like simple tutorials from time to time, and then different types of way of solving issues in Android. And yeah, so links to the all information here. And I'm going to share my slides. I'm going to do do this. I want to share my slides. I don't know if
you can send it to me and I will share it. I'll send it to the email.
Perfect, even perfect. But that's it from me.
Congratulations on your book, and I hope that you're gonna have more achievements in the very soon future. We have one question here.
Sure.
What your recommendation for a tool for a beginner tester?
Yes, so for a beginner tester, first what I want to understand is, are you writing Android or what stack are you using first?
Web-based, let's say.
Web-based, okay. So for web-based, I wouldn't lie that I'm not a pretty professional on that because I'm an Android person. I've been doing Android for the past like 8 years. So I think I don't like lying. I like telling the truth. I think I wouldn't be the right one to answer for the web, but for everybody that's a beginner for Android, if you're starting out and you're using either Jetpack Compose, which is the fast recommended to use for UI, I would highly recommend you just try using the already made espresso because it's pretty easy to understand with all the cheat sheet they provide. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of learning curve in everything. I feel like in everything in engineering, there's a lot of learning curve. So just spend your time, look into it and research more and see how you can just improve. Another thing that I always say is that it's not easy. It's never easy. So it's just the learning process, always trying to learn, always trying to understand how it's done. And I feel like right now that Jetpack Compose is purely Kotlin, it's going to be easier for new learners or new beginners to understand it because you don't have to understand how to test an XML code and also a Kotlin code. So now you can do both. You can just test Kotlin and then Kotlin, and you're good. You get what I mean? So it's just one language that you're testing. So espresso is good.
Mhm. We have another question about the software. So the person is asking, does espresso support old-fashioned applications like Oracle Forms and Report?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure it. That's pretty interesting. That is something I would definitely look into because I've not dealt with the old-fashioned applications, but I do know it goes way back because it's pretty stable. So it's something that can be explored. So maybe as such would help on that, but definitely something that you can look into. And if it doesn't, you can look into other like the UI Automate and see if that's already used, or the old ones that we had. I think there's another one that I didn't mention that was used before, Redux. I think it's the Redux. Either Redux might be used actually in even in web, but don't quote me, might be wrong on that.
That's definitely something that we would look into after this session because it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today with us. So thank you for giving us this remarkable presentation. It was an eye-opener, of course, for everyone here in this session. Thank you.
Totally.
And have a nice day.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I share where we can connect. If anybody has a question for me,
I'd
like to
please,
share this. Yes.
Share your socials in the chat so everyone can connect with you.
Yes, doing that. So this is my website. I'm gonna make sure I'm sharing with the community here. Okay, that's my website, and I'm mostly active on Twitter. Oh, that's my. So recently I started doing podcasts. So I think I need to add that to my bio now. Podcast host.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, and that's my Twitter. I use Twitter a lot. I know Twitter, it's where most of us engineers were, but now that things are going south, I'm also on Mastodon, but I find it a little bit isolating because it's only based on your profession, so you don't get to interact with other people, which I find that to be sad because I would like to interact with other people, not just join one server, but I think that's a story for another day. Oh, and LinkedIn. And you shared my LinkedIn. Yes, thank you so much too for hosting me. This was great. It was great talking to the community. And bye.
It was actually our pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Sure. Bye.